They had been warned that the Americans would torture them, starve them, strip them of dignity, and parade them through humiliation. But when Japanese prisoners stepped through the gates of Camp McCoy in 1944, they discovered that the enemy broke them not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. When the train screeched to a halt in the frozen Wisconsin winter, dozens of weary Japanese soldiers stepped down onto the snow-packed ground, blinking into a pale, colorless light. Their uniforms were torn, some held together by strips of cloth or bits of wire. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken with exhaustion, lips cracked from cold and weeks of hunger. They had survived the front lines, the surrender, and the long train across America. But this, they believed, was where it would end. From their first day in the Imperial Army, they had been taught that capture was worse than death. To be taken alive was to lose honor, to betray emperor and country. American captivity, they were told, meant torture and starvation, an existence worse than nothing. So when the guards barked commands and the train doors slid open, many expected to be shot where they stood. Instead, they were met with quiet order. Wooden barracks stood neatly in rows beyond the wire fences. Guard towers loomed, but the air carried not the chaos of cruelty, but the strange calm of routine. Trucks moved along plowed roads, and from the chimneys of kitchens rose smoke that smelled of food, real food, rich and thick, a scent that made some of the men dizzy with hunger. They hesitated, shuffling forward as commands echoed in English, sharp and unfamiliar. Interpreters repeated the orders. Line up. Move forward. Do not break formation. Red Cross officials stood nearby, clipboards in hand, observing every step. Their presence alone unsettled the prisoners. They had been told that America had no law, no mercy, no honor. Yet here were neutral men enforcing rules, watching to ensure those rules were followed. Could that be real? The intake process began with the cold precision of bureaucracy, but it carried something the men could not name. Humanity. They were deloused. Their lice-ridden uniforms burned, their bodies examined for fever and wounds. A soldier with a festering arm wound braced for indifference, but an American medic cleaned it, rewrapped it, and told him, through an interpreter, to rest. The man sat frozen, staring at the bandage. Why would an enemy do this? One whispered to another. They will trick us, wait. Fear lingered in every breath. They moved like ghosts through each step, waiting for the cruelty they'd been promised. But as the hours passed, the cruelty never came. The camp, it turned out, followed the Geneva Convention, something the prisoners had heard of but never believed in. They were marched through the snow to their new quarters. The barracks were rough but warm, each with a stove and stacks of wool blankets. For men who had slept in caves and trenches, it was almost unbearable to imagine this comfort was real. Some sat carefully on their bunks as if afraid the softness would vanish. There was no freedom here, only fences, barbed wire, and watchtowers. But it wasn't hell either. It was something more disorienting: order. For men raised to believe that surrender meant disgrace and capture meant degradation, Camp McCoy was a paradox. The guards were strict but not cruel. The rules were firm but fair. A guard helped a limping prisoner to his feet instead of striking him. A medic wrapped another man's wrist with quiet care. A Red Cross worker inspected ration lists to ensure fairness. The acts were small, almost invisible, yet to the prisoners they felt impossible. That first night, lying under wool blankets, the men could not sleep. The camp was silent except for the wind against the barracks walls and the distant sound of boots crunching snow. For the first time in months, they were warm. For the first time since capture, they were alive. But they did not feel safe, not yet. The mind clung to suspicion, whispering that kindness was a prelude to something worse. Still, as they drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought rose and fell among them like breath. Captivity looked nothing like the nightmare they had imagined. When morning came, they woke not to shouts or blows but to a bugle call. The sound startled many. It was familiar, the same notes that had marked mornings in their own army camps. For a heartbeat, some forgot where they were. Then came the commands in English, the roll call, the march to the mess hall. Hunger made their hands shake. They expected punishment through deprivation, the denial of food, the scraps left for the conquered. Hunger had been their companion for months, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the collapsing islands of the Pacific. They had eaten rice so thin it was little more than water, barley stretched with roots, scraps of dried fish. Meat had become memory, sugar, fantasy. Before they were fed, an interpreter gathered them inside a hall where a Red Cross representative spoke through translation. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be housed, fed, allowed to write letters home. They would work, but not beyond reason. They would not be beaten. They would be visited by neutral observers to ensure compliance. The men stared in disbelief. One whispered to his comrade, "They speak of rights. What rights could captives have?" "These are not promises," the interpreter replied firmly. "These are rules, for them as well as for you." The words hung heavy in the cold air. Rules for both sides. That concept alone was more disorienting than the journey that had brought them here. Afterward came more medical checks. American doctors weighed them, frowned at the numbers, handed out vitamins, small white tablets that some prisoners refused to touch, suspecting poison. Others swallowed them out of obedience. A soldier muttered, half in awe, half in resentment, "Medicine for enemies." By afternoon they were issued new clothes, plain brown uniforms stenciled with PW in bold white paint. The fabric was thick, the fit practical. Some men slipped into them carefully, others with a strange relief shedding the ragged remnants of the empire like a second skin. Outside, the snow still fell. Guards stood watch, rifles at their sides, but their posture was calm. No shouting, no violence, only order. When an elderly prisoner stumbled, a guard caught him by the arm, steadied him, and moved on. The gesture left the man trembling more from confusion than from cold. That night, as the wind hissed against the barracks, the men spoke in low tones. "They speak of rules as if this is an agreement," one said bitterly. Another replied, "They must be pretending. It cannot be real." Yet in the silence that followed, the scent from the kitchens drifted through the cracks, thick, meaty, warm. Hunger made their stomachs twist. Tomorrow, they thought, would reveal the trick. But what awaited them was not a trick. It was a meal, a hamburger and a bottle of Coca-Cola, that would shake their beliefs more profoundly than any interrogation ever could. The next morning came cold and pale. Snow still clung to the eaves of the barracks and frost shimmered on the ground. The prisoners lined up outside, boots crunching in rhythm as they were marched toward the mess hall. Fear still sat heavy in their stomachs, mingled with the dull ache of hunger. Many expected the food to be scarce, spoiled or unfit for animals, punishment disguised as sustenance. Inside, the hall was warm and filled with the hiss of steam and the smell of something impossible: meat. Rich, smoky, and unfamiliar. The scent alone unsettled the men. It was too strong, too foreign, a smell that belonged to another world. The line moved slowly. Tin trays clattered in nervous hands. The American cooks behind the counter worked methodically, spatulas scraping, trays filling, bottles popping. Then, for the first time, a Japanese soldier stepped forward and froze. A hot patty sizzled as it landed on a soft bun. Beside it, golden fried potatoes. And then, the sound of a bottle cap hissing open. The cook slid the tray forward without a glance. The soldier stared down, baffled. The red script on the sweating glass bottle looked almost decorative, the liquid inside dark and alive with bubbles. He didn't move until the guard behind him growled, "Move along." He shuffled to the side, still staring at the tray as whispers began to ripple down the line. "They're giving us meat? Real meat?" One by one, trays filled with the same strange offerings: hamburgers, fries, and bottles of something cold and sweet. The prisoners sat at long wooden tables, unsure what to do. Some sniffed the food. Others watched, waiting for a signal that it was safe. The first sip of Coca-Cola was like swallowing a spark. The sweetness hit first, then the sharp burn of carbonation. Men coughed, startled. Some laughed in disbelief, others blinked back tears. A few clasped the bottles in both hands as if holding something sacred. At one table, a thin soldier lifted his hamburger carefully, sniffed it, then took a tentative bite. Grease ran down his chin. His eyes closed. For a moment, his jaw stopped moving. Then he lowered his head and began to weep silently. His bunkmate leaned close. "Are you all right?" The man swallowed hard. I had forgotten the taste of fat. All around, similar scenes played out. Cautious bites, stunned faces, hands trembling with confusion. Some men whispered that the food must be a trick, meant to weaken them or make them talk. Others simply ate in silence, tears sliding down their cheeks. The Americans behind the counter paid little attention. To them, it was a routine meal, the same lunch they served every Tuesday. But to the prisoners, it was something that defied belief. This was not the cruelty they had been told to expect. It was worse because it was kindness. The contrast was unbearable. These men had been taught that the American soldier was a savage, that his country was starving, crumbling, morally bankrupt. Yet here in captivity, they ate better than they had as free soldiers of the empire. The humiliation was sharp, but so was the relief. When the trays were empty and the bottles drained, the hall fell silent. Some prisoners folded their hands as if in prayer. Others stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. The guards gave the order to rise, and the men filed out into the snow, still whispering about what they had tasted. As weeks turned into months, Camp McCoy became a strange reflection of life itself, disciplined, repetitive, yet strangely human. The prisoners rose each morning to the sound of the bugle, worked under the gray sky, and returned to barracks that no longer felt entirely foreign. Letters from home were read in trembling hands. Some brought relief, others only silence. At night, men whispered memories of Tokyo streets, of rice fields, of mothers' voices fading like old songs. Between guards and prisoners, a quiet understanding began to form, not of friendship, but of recognition. Once an American soldier offered a prisoner a stick of gum. The man, unsure what to do, swallowed it whole. The Americans burst out laughing, and even the prisoner smiled, embarrassed but alive. In that small, absurd moment, both sides remembered they were human. Men born into opposite wars, trapped inside the same winter. Even as routine settled over the camp, the prisoners' minds were never still. Some clung to the hope that Japan would turn the tide, that the empire would rise again. And every day without news felt like a test of loyalty. Others, worn down by hunger, fatigue, and the unrelenting care of their captors, whispered that defeat was inevitable. Arguments erupted in the barracks, voices sharp with frustration and disbelief. "You dishonor our homeland when you speak of surrender," one shouted. "And you dishonor reason by denying what is before your eyes," another fired back. The guards intervened quietly, but the tension lingered, a reminder that even in captivity, the war lived in their hearts. And yet, amid this turmoil, small acts of normalcy began to carve space for something else. Moments of laughter during English lessons, shared stories of home, wooden toys carved in free hours, the quiet thrill of chocolate or a sip of Coca-Cola. These fleeting sparks of life, small as they were, began to chip away at the rigid walls of fear and expectation, proving that even behind barbed wire, humanity could not be entirely contained. In the end, the greatest shock for the prisoners of Camp McCoy was not the fences, the roll calls, or even the work. It was the realization that their enemy could be ordinary, even kind. The war raged far beyond the wire, yet inside the camp, life followed its own rhythm. Meals on time, blankets on cots, letters arriving, work to be done. The guards were strict but not cruel, the rules unyielding but fair. And in the spaces between duty and routine, moments of shared humanity flickered through. Smiles, laughter, a piece of gum, a word spoken across the language barrier. Those hamburgers and bottles of Coca-Cola, once inconceivable, became symbols not of weakness but of a truth they had never expected, that even in war, compassion could exist.